Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Rhonda Wisniak and I am a registered psychologist at River's Edge Counseling Center. Today, I'm going to speak about teen mental health, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about how this presentation came to be. A couple months ago, a junior high school asked me to speak on this topic. And in particular, the session was designed for parents who are concerned about their own teen and mental health, as well as factors that are a typical part of development. For example, what's the difference between stress and anxiety, or anxious feelings and anxiety disorder, feeling down, to something more clinical like depression. So this session was designed to discuss more about teen mental health and the factors that impact a teen's mental health, as well as the continuum that moves from a typical stressor that occurs in teenagehood to more significant stressors to what we might consider clinical presentation, which would require more significant intervention. So I'll be sharing a PowerPoint presentation with you today. I want to share that a lot of the information has come from the website Teen Mental Health Literacy, which is a research institute that focuses on teen mental health. Okay. I'm going to start with the analogy of a jackfish. I was a teacher before I began working as a psychologist. And when I entered my teaching career, my uncle, who was a longtime principal in a junior high school, said to me, teenagers are like jackfish. That's when their bodies start growing and their brains stop. And he dealt with a lot of teenage issues, behavioral challenges, and this was his analogy that he gave me. And in some ways, he was right. And in some ways, we've learned more about how teen brains develop. And the development of brains during the teenage period impacts their mental health and their behavior. So I just wanted to start out with this little jackfish that is our starting analogy. The teenage brain actually doesn't stop growing during the teenage years. It's actually changing significantly. We have spent a lot of resources understanding early childhood brains and the importance of that development. The teenage brain is going through a lot of changes as well. So although our brain is almost fully developed around 6 years of age, brain development changes and it's going through significant changes during this time. So when we see some teenage behavior, we'll often chalk it up to hormones and puberty. And some of those factors definitely play a part, but what is playing a bigger role is a teen's changing brain. So during this time, there is a growth of brain matter and therefore the brains are forming more new connections. So that is when more abstract thinking comes into play, although teens don't do very well at that, but sometimes our expectations are that they would be. So there is a time of which brain matter grows and that there are a number of new connections being made. There's also a process that's taking place called pruning, and this is kind of the use it or lose it policy. So in order for our brains to be more efficient when they get to adulthood and be better problem solvers when they get to adulthood, we have to prune some of the unused portions of the brain. So during teenage time, whatever a teen is doing during that time, those connections become stronger. So if they're doing things like playing sports or continuing to work on music, learning languages, learning how to code, those connections will get stronger. But if they stop doing some things during this time, those connections can start being pruned away. So it's important to consider what your teen is spending time at during this time, because those are the connections in the brain that will get stronger. So if it's Candy Crush, Fortnite, uh, if they're still going to use those skills in adulthood, they will be growing stronger. But it's also an important time to be using all parts of the brain, because otherwise we can lose some of those skills and problem-solving abilities. During this time, also, the pathways are getting, we call it myelinated, but they're becoming faster, more efficient. They're kind of in a partial development during teenage time. So sometimes teens can appear slow at processing information. That's just because their brain's in the process of really solidifying the pathways that they're going to use, making them faster, more stable, and more efficient as they get to adulthood. So although it may seem as though teenage brains are not growing during this time, they actually are changing and developing and evolving so that they have better brains when we get to adulthood. Although that doesn't happen until maybe 25 or 30 years old. So we have to make sure our expectations are at a still continuing developed brain, even though their bodies may be fully developed. And it's just important to keep in mind that some important changes are happening during this time. These changes impact behavior, they impact emotions, and so those are important to keep in mind, especially when we're talking about teenage mental health. Our brain is maturing during this time. So if we think of our brain as a fist, this is being the brain stem, and the brain is maturing from the back of the brain to the front. And the front of the brain is where our executive functions live. So those are the parts of our brain that are used in planning, organization, impulse control, reasoning, goal setting. And the back of the brain has many of the features related to emotions and our sensory processes. So when the brain matures from the back to the front, it doesn't mature at the same rate. So areas of the brain associated with things like reward, motivation, impulsivity, those mature earlier. And so this can lead to some riskier behaviors without being able to use the front of the brain to consider pros and cons. Studies have shown that teens know when they're engaging in risky behavior, but they believe that the benefits would outweigh any potential harm. So when we hook up adults' brains and teenage brains and give them different problem-solving tasks, or have them simulate driving, risky driving behavior, for example, we see that teen brains and adult brains react differently. So that's important to keep into mind in terms of a primary concern, which can be around impulsivity, for example. If a child, a youth, comes and parents are concerned, for example, about ADHD. ADHD, in order to be diagnosed, had to have been present in the early developmental time, because we know in teenage brains, things like attention and impulsivity can change and actually may increase based on your peer group, because we mature at different rates. So if concerns with attention, for example, just start showing up when a youth is in their teenage years, we might consider that it might be more related to brain development than it is ADHD. The pleasure and reward centers of the brain light up more than children's brains. Teenage brains love big rewards, the big goal, beating the final boss in a video game. if there is a large reward, something that youth sees as a large reward, their brains light up like a Vegas slot machine. They get really excited about things that are large rewards. But if there are small rewards, teenage brains barely light up at all. So that is important to keep in mind, because acknowledgement from peers is also highly rewarding for teens. So getting a bunch of likes on social media, that maybe a few isn't that rewarding. You get a lot of comments, a lot of followers, their brains are craving the big excitement. And that's why riskier behavior can also come into play when teenagers are considering activities to partake in, and they can feel like this risk and reward is more motivating to me than what may be a possible punishment for the behavior. Our brains are also in control of our emotions, and teens can have very overwhelming emotional input, but they cannot explain what they are thinking. So like we talked about before, if the emotion center is here and the frontal lobe, or explaining and the thinking, problem-solving parts of our brain aren't quite as developed, they can feel an overwhelming emotional input and output, but may not be able to explain what they're thinking. So when connecting adults and teenagers to an MRI, adolescents often misread facial expressions. So they were shown different facial expressions and asked about them. And when seeing different faces, adults use the problem-solving or frontal part of their brain to interpret emotions. So they're being rational and thinking about what emotions might be on someone's face, while teenagers use the emotional center of their brains. So that could cause some misinterpretation. So concern can be misread as anger, or worry can be misconstrued as disappointment. So they can misinterpret the emotions of the adults around them. And so if you interpret someone's concern as anger, the way you respond to that would be quite different. Or if a teen feels as though they may be a disappointment, instead of worrying about their safety, that can change reactions. And there's a really good resource called The Elegant Brain, which talks more about this and some of the research that's being done on teenage brains. So this is a visual that is part of the documentation from The Elegant Brain, and it shows some of the difference between adult brains and teenage brains and why there may be misunderstandings between the two. In the hippocampus right here, teens have a tremendous learning curve. They have the opportunity to do great growth in learning. And so that area of the brain is developing and continues to develop, and teens continue to have great potential for learning. This is the reward center of the brain, not fully developed in teens, but in adults is fully developed. So they're more excited by reward than consequence, as we discussed earlier. The parietal lobe that's responsible for touch, sight, language keeps growing until the early 20s, but continue to not, in teenagers, don't process information as effectively, still building those pathways. The amygdala, which is the emotional core, teens are much more impulsive, relying on the emotional core for things like passion, impulse, fear, aggression. They feel love strongly, they feel fear strongly, and sometimes aggression strongly. Adults rely less on this part of the brain in terms of interpreting and problem-solving information. They're using this prefrontal cortex, which includes things like planning and reasoning, and continues to grow up until the age of 25. Some say almost closer to 30. But in the teenage time, this is an immaturely developed part of the brain and can result in high risk behavior, not being able to think out well the pros and cons of a behavior or a response to emotions. So what can parents do if these parts of our brain, of teenage brains, aren't fully developed yet? Continuing to discuss the consequences of actions, that actions have consequences and what those might be. Teens don't do well at thinking out what the consequences could be and weighing that out versus the reward, because the reward is just so enticing. Teens can be really focused in the moment. That is something that is so great about teenagers. They can be very appealing of when working with teenagers. They're really focused in the moment. They're doing it all without thinking about what happened before or what could happen next. But they may need help seeing that they can also play a part in making changes for the future. Of course, showing an interest in things that are interesting to teens, even though they may or may not be interesting to adults. And also making sure that you ask teens if they want you to respond or if they just want someone to listen. Adults have the need to want to jump to their problem-solving brain and help a teen problem solve through a situation, a problem, an area of concern. And sometimes what they just want, and maybe most of the time, is that they just want someone to listen. So we always recommend asking teens if they want you to respond or if they just want someone to listen. And this information is from the Stanford Children's Understanding Teen Brains. And Jay Geed, who's a neuroscientist, he said, the more technical and more advanced the science becomes, often the more it leads us back to some very basic tenets of spending loving quality time with our children. The brain is largely wired for social interaction and for bonding with caretakers. So science has become increasingly complex, although we still know very little about the brain. The more ability we have to measure the brain, to do very complex studies, it really comes down to some tenets that are really basic in terms of what our grandparents or great-grandparents would have understood about caring for children and caring for teens. Sleep also plays a role in terms of a teen's overall health and their mental health. Their major brain redevelopment occurs when teens sleep because that's the time that growth hormones are released. And teenagers actually require more sleep than adults, but their sleep cycles are often skewed. So melatonin is released in adults around, there's an error there, at 10 p.m., but it's not released until teenagers until closer to 1 a.m. So those sleepy feelings that may come in adults around 10 p.m. don't start coming for teens until closer to 1 a.m. So there's a part of our biology that impacts teenage sleep, but then exposure to electronics, staying up late into the night, the blue light, those also impact our ability to sleep. So many teenagers are really sleep deprived, which can result in impulsive and irritable behavior. And if you think back to a time when your children, newborns, you were getting very little sleep for some part of your life, you can then empathize with the irritability that comes with lack of sleep. So that's also an important factor to keep in mind because many teenagers are sleep deprived. Part of it can be attributed to their behavior and part of it can be attributed to their biology. And the way schedules are set up are not designed for starting to feel sleepy at 1 a.m., especially starting times of school. The important part here is still a lot is unknown. We are learning more and more about the brain, how it impacts at different stages of development, including early adulthood and into later adulthood and the development of the child's brain as well. And we can make some hypotheses, but there really is no direct link. Well, because of this, this happens. And we do an MRI in your child, this is happening, so that equals this, because it's just so complex. There are so many things going on at the same time. But I wanted to include this part because understanding the teen brain may help understand your own teenagers and some of the behaviors or challenges you may be experiencing or that they may be experiencing. We're going to move now from talking about the teenage brain to teenage mental health. And this video, which I'm going to share, is about the language we use. Teens often throw out clinical labels like, I'm so depressed right now, or don't worry about me, it's just my OCD that wants to keep my locker really clean. Or, sorry, I wasn't paying attention, I think I have ADHD. Those are very clinical labels to behaviors that might be typical or part of the typical range of development. Anxiety is often one that's used a lot. I'm so anxious about this. I have anxiety, so I can't do A, B, C, or D. And so that can happen. And there is a strong push in TikTok videos to use diagnostic labels, ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, for example, and show little clips of this is what an ADHD brain looks like. If you do this, you may think about ADHD or autism spectrum disorder. Autism spectrum disorder continues to be a fairly rare diagnosis, but there is a lot of TikTok videos that are surround that topic. So I think that sometimes some of the media that teens are watching can lead to the use of language that may fit them or may not, but diagnostic labels are very different than feeling a stressed out behavior. So this video is really about language, and this is from the mentalhealthliteracy.org that focuses on teen mental health.
Have you ever wondered about the difference between the terms mental health, mental distress, or mental illness? The language out there can be confusing and sometimes even conflicted. When we use phrases such as mental health issue, mental wellness, or mental problem, no one really knows what we're talking about. Using the correct language not only helps us to intervene more effectively, but it also reduces stigma. We've got a tool to help everyone get on the same page when it comes to talking about mental health. We like to think of it in terms of a pyramid with these 4 different states. Everyone falls somewhere on the pyramid, with more people on the bottom and less at the top. In the bottom category, we have no distress or no problem. Everything's going fine, and we're generally enjoying ourselves. We may be spending time with friends, attending school, or even sleeping. One level up, we have mental distress. Mental distress refers to the everyday problems that we encounter. These are things that irritate us, things that we're worried about, or problems that come our way. For example, we might have an upcoming presentation to give, or we may have had conflict with a friend or had a flat tire. When this happens, our brain sends us a signal. It's called the stress response. Our stress response is the basis of resilience and adaptation. Once we successfully solve the problem, the stress response usually goes away because we've developed the skills we needed to adapt. We don't want to go out of our way and protect ourselves from these normal stressors of everyday life, because problem solving through these stressors is how we ultimately develop resiliency and the capacity to become successful adults. But oftentimes in life, we're faced with problems in our environment that are simply too big for us to quickly solve or deep breathe our way through. That's what we call a mental health problem, which is the 3rd level up in the pyramid. Mental health problems are serious events such as a parent dying, having a divorce in your family, moving to a new country without sufficient resources. Mental health problems may keep us up at night. They may cause intense emotions, and they may last for a long period of time. But remember, they're normal. These are difficult times when it's important to reach out to others for help. Mental health problems may require the support of friends, family, counseling, or just time. The top of the pyramid, reserved for the fewest number of people, is a mental disorder or mental illness. This includes diagnoses such as clinical depression, clinical anxiety, or bipolar disorder. A mental disorder is very different than a mental health problem. This is where we see something going on in the brain, a perturbation of usual brain functioning. This is where evidence-based medical and therapeutic treatment is needed by specially trained professionals. Remember, the pyramid is not a continuum. Mental distress does not necessarily lead to a mental health problem or to a mental illness. In fact, we can even be at each level of the pyramid at the same time. For instance, someone can have ADHD, mental disorder, be grieving the loss of a loved one, mental problem, have an upcoming exam that they're worried about, mental distress, and sometimes they can just forget all about it and feel fine. All of these levels or components of the pyramid are part of our overall mental health. We need to make sure that we don't define good mental health as never having a bad mood. Good mental health includes a wide variety of emotional states. There are times when we are frustrated, indifferent, happy, sad, lazy, joyous. These are all parts of life and normal fluctuations in our mood. If a person has a mental illness, it doesn't mean that they lose their mental health. So let's start using the correct language, because it really does matter. Depression is not the same as feeling sad, and ADHD is not the same as being hyperactive. When we speak from a common framework, we're reducing stigma and building the foundation for better mental health care for everyone. To learn more, check out teenmentalhealth.org.
Helen Hansel was able to win.
Okay, so I thought that that's a good video that really emphasizes the movement between the different levels and going through a difficult time, and maybe a significantly difficult time, including the loss of someone close to you, does not necessarily result in a mental health disorder. One of the things that I think was really important in that video was identifying that the stress response actually leads to adaptation, resilience, and skill development. We do not want to avoid stress responses during the teenage time. As we talked about before, this is an important part of brain development. Use it or lose it. If you don't have the opportunity to experience stress, to develop, adapt, and build the skills necessary to manage those stressful times, that will become more difficult for you in adulthood. So this is normal. Having stress is normal. Stress is not clinical anxiety. It is a part of our overall development. And when we feel stress and someone doesn't save us from it, then we can develop the skills for resilience, for change, and for evolution, meaning that you're better in the long run over time. And we develop skills. And sometimes we make mistakes as adults, as teenagers, and it's a time to learn and it's a time to grow. So I really hope parents see themselves as an important part of this continuum that leads to skill development. And a really important part is understanding stress is normal, especially stress around achievement or reaching goals or getting a job. Feeling stressed because you have a part-time job, you're going to school, you're also on a sports team. Those are normal stressors. And of course, there can a time where it gets too much, but knowing that this also is the time where we can build that resilience, adaptation, skill development, especially on the terms of planning, being a good schedule, setting up time for homework. That's important to recognize during this time. And if teenagers don't have the opportunity to do that, that is part of the concerns in terms of COVID, for example. Teenagers were out of that time of dealing with some normal stressors because of changes that happened to our overall environment. So they didn't have the chance to go on dates, for example, or, experience some other things for a year, sometimes more, sometimes less. But that was an important problem-solving time. But I think that we can still make up ground if we're supporting our teens and recognizing that stress is an important part, and that it's not the role of parents to save teens from that stress, but to support them so that they build the resilience and adaptation skills. Stress is described in this inverted U relationship between stress and performance. This graph highlights the importance of teens experiencing stress and being able to cope with it. If teens are in a space right here where there's low pressure, they can often feel bored, comfortable, but bored. We have our best area of performance in the top of this peak here. So if we don't give teen students the opportunity to feel this stress and pressure, they get kind of these little U's, and they never get to this part where they can show the best area of performance. So teens will often use the word anxiety. I'm feeling so anxious about this. And it's important to determine if that's a stress response or if it's truly anxiety. We're supposed to feel uncomfortable. Learning occurs when we're uncomfortable. And that's actually where we have our best performance. We want to go out into a soccer game and feel that excitement, that stress, that pressure. And sometimes that results in a positive result, and sometimes it doesn't. But if we don't have these feelings of stress, it does not reach our area of best performance in any area of a teen's life. There comes a time where the stress gets too much, where you may see a very high stress response, crying, uncontrollable anxiety, vomiting, unhappiness. That's too much stress. And sometimes teens have been in a place where they've had a lot of stress through their whole life, and they can not reach this point because they're always in this high stress position. But this graph just really highlights the importance of stress and the stress response to actually being the best performer you could be. Where challenges with teens' ability to manage anxious feelings or any other type of response to the stress. When this says anxiety, but can also be used or stress, what happens to our bodies if we scan for danger? We have physical symptoms that intensify, our attention narrows, and if we escape that, we go home, we don't go to school. Escape or avoidance, that brings short-term relief. However, in the long term, it actually increases signs of anxiety if a teen escapes those uncomfortable feelings all the time, because you get this short-term relief and our reward center of our brain goes, see, we didn't have to deal with all that stress. This feels much better to be in a place that we're comfortable. But in the long term, that can actually increase stress feelings because we didn't develop the skills to manage them. If you want to reverse this cycle, we want to confront feared situations. Anxiety can only reach a certain point and it has to go down. It can't get any higher. If we are in the space, it will inevitably go down. So in the short time, there'll be a slight increase in anxiety, and but then there'll be a decrease in physical symptoms. It gives a time to use coping skills to get to a managed level, and in the long run, there's a greater belief in ability to control one's own responses and be a part of their own mental health in terms of using the skills that they would need to cope in situations of high stress. So similar to talking about the importance of teens dealing with stress, if they escape stressful situations all the time, it actually builds the stress response and even can turn into stronger signs of a clinical diagnosis such as anxiety. So what do teens need to be resilient? And I would highly recommend the work of Dr. Michael Unger. If you search in podcasts, I'm sure that he will have spoken on this topic. He's a very good speaker. He does a lot of interesting research, and his focus is on resiliency. And he has founded a place called the Resilience Research Center, and their research areas are around resilience. And they've identified what do teens need to be resilient. And these are what they identify. One is structure, boundaries, structured sense of their day, which we lost in somewhat when we were at home during COVID. Consequences. That means there's a consequence for your behavior, your actions, and determining what that is. Teens like to live within boundaries, even though they're always pushing back on them. Consequences are important in terms of being able to develop that resiliency. The parent-child connection and lots of strong relationships with other adults or peers, aunts, uncles, coaches, friends of parents of friends. That's another important part. A powerful identity, seeing themselves with a clear identity of who they are, being able to connect with that, helping parents to be able to explore, parents helping teens to be able to explore that identity. And the question of adolescence is, who am I? Which moves all the way into our 20s and sometimes farther. But the development of an identity that's outside of maybe some superficial portrayals of ourselves, that, for example, that can happen on social media. A sense of control. Teens need to make their own choices about some things. They need to know that they have control over some aspects of their life, and knowing that when things go awry, that those choices also result in consequences. A sense of belonging, culture, spirituality, being connected to something bigger than themselves, whether that's a school, whether that's their overall culture, whether that's related to religious experiences. Feeling like you belong is a really important piece. And if you look into lots of frameworks related to Indigenous healing and mental health, a sense of belonging is almost always a part of that. Having a purpose to their life, having rights and responsibilities, and always the foundation is they need to feel safe and they need to have a place of support. Safety, being able to have biological needs met, food, sleep, and safety are, of course, the foundation. So Dr. Unger talks more about all of these areas that helps to build resilience. And I would encourage you to read his books, listen to his podcasts, or look more into that if that's something that you're interested in. After all that we spoke about, we know that teenagers still experience significant mental health issues. In every given year, 1 in 5 Canadians experiences a mental illness. By the time Canadians reach 40 years of age, 1 in 2 have or have had a mental illness. Young people aged 15 to 24 are more likely to experience mental illness and or substance use disorders than any other age group. So Although we can explain and talk about supporting teens, it is also a time where there are significant mental health concerns. So what would be the signs? Many children and youth will exhibit different moods, thoughts, and behaviors that are a part of normal development. That can include having times where they get lower marks in school, where they avoid friends and family, where they have outbursts of anger, where there's changes to sleeping and eating habits, where they rebel against authority, where they drink alcohol or use drugs, stop doing things that they used to enjoy. They worry a lot, have frequent mood swings. They stop caring about their appearance, having to tell them to shower, become really focused on their weight, where they lack motivation, do more risky things, or feel very down. So many of these things, which if done a lot, would be associated with a mental illness, or a mental disorder. These things are also a normal part of the teenage experience and can happen for short periods of time. But these characteristics may be signs of a mental health disorder if they're intense, where they persist over long periods of time, if they're inappropriate for the child's age, and when they interfere with the youth's life. So that's a really important factor. Do they interfere with the jobs of their developmental period? So their jobs during the teenage time are to do well at school, to make good friends, to enjoy something outside of school that's an extracurricular activity, whatever that might be, and possibly to do some part-time work. So if more than one of these areas are being impacted in terms of their family, their schoolwork, their ability to socialize with others, that's when we become more concerned about these behaviors. So where do you seek help? If knowing that some of these behaviors are appropriate for the developmental level, but it is becoming more intense, and if there's ever a concern for safety, all of these things kind of get put aside. If you're worried about the safety of a child or a youth in that exact moment, that is when those things would be put aside and need to be sought out by a doctor. Of course, wanting to be careful about whether you take a teen, for example, to an emergency room, because that sometimes can increase some of these feelings. But if safety is a primary concern, that might have to be an option. So where to seek help? Your family doctor, a private therapist, River's Edge Counseling Center, for example, of a number of therapists who work in this area. There are some school-based supports, really depends on your school or your school board. There's a mental health helpline. There's also a crisis line in Edmonton if you are concerned about safety with your teen or someone else in your home. The Canadian Mental Health Association and Together All is also, mental health is becoming more and more on the top of the agenda in terms of understanding what teens need in school, outside of school. The coordination of those services across and being able to communicate, for example, a family doctor and a psychiatrist being able to communicate. We still have work to do in that area for sure, but there is, if you called 311, for example, there are a number of supports if you felt like you were in a crisis situation, just being very careful to understand what that would be. The resources used for this presentation really focused on mental health literacy, the Resilience Research Center, the Elegant Brain, and the Mental Health Association. I thank you for joining me in this session today. If there anything that you needed in terms of further questions or needed the support of a therapist, you can always reach out to River's Edge Counseling Center. My role is I predominantly work in assessments. So assessments are used to identify if a child, a teen, an adult does meet the criteria for a mental health disorder, then that is my primary role. And then the therapists that work here are working in terms of interventions, although I always provide recommendations for home and school. So thank you again for joining me. I hope that you have a really nice day.